I'm Professor Steve Johnson at Mercer Law School, and this video is part of a series of videos that review important statutory and administrative law cases covered in my statutory law course source. In this video, I'll be discussing United States versus Bass. This case involves the interpretation of a statute in light of the rule of lenity. So before discussing the case, I want to briefly discuss the rule of lenity, one of the important canons of statutory interpretation. So it's actually one of the oldest substantive policy canons of statutory interpretation, and it dates back to the British common law during the reign of King Henry VIII. Under the canon, statutes that impose penal sanctions should be interpreted strictly so that any ambiguity is resolved in the defendant's favor. Now, the rule applies to statutes that impose punitive civil sanctions as well as statutes that impose criminal sanctions. So it applies to penal sanction statutes generally. It's a tiebreaker, so it only applies when a court concludes, after examining all other sources of interpretation, that the statute is ambiguous. So theoretically, at least, it's not supposed to be a canon that's trotted out right at the beginning of the analysis. It's reserved for situations where the statute is ambiguous. One last important caveat about the rule of lenity. Rule of lenity requires the court to interpret a statute narrowly, but only if there are two reasonable interpretations of the statute. Courts shouldn't use the rule of lenity to justify an interpretation of a statute that's unreasonable, just because that would be, more in line with the interests of the defendant. So they shouldn't do that. Okay. So what are the rationales? There have been several rationales advanced for the rule of lenity. Primary justification for the canon is that it provides fair notice to persons who are subject to penal sanctions. Some, but not all, commentators suggest notice requirement is based on constitutional due process protections, but it really applies more broadly than that. It's not just limited to due process. It's a broader concept of fairness generally. Now, separation of powers concerns have also been identified as another rationale for the canon. Under that line of reasoning, legislatures have the power to define criminal conduct, so the canon prevents the judiciary from creating criminal law when the legislature has not spoken clearly. So with that background in place, let's take a look at United States versus Bass, which is a 1971 U.S. Supreme Court case where the court relied on the rule of lenity to read a statutory sentencing provision narrowly in favor of the defendants. The case centered on the interpretation of a provision of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. And that provision provided any person who has been convicted by a court of the United States or any political subdivision thereof, or a state or any political subdivision thereof, of a felony, and here's the important language, and who receives, possesses, or transports in commerce or affecting commerce any firearm shall be fined not more than $100,000 or imprisoned for not more than 2 years or both. So in February 1968, Dennis Bass was convicted in the New York Supreme Court of attempted grand larceny in the second degree, which is a felony. Now, a year later, in 1969, in July, Bass had in his possession, on 2 separate occasions, a pistol and a shotgun. And in 1970, he was convicted in federal district court in New York, based on those 2 situations, of possessing firearms in violation of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, statute I showed you above. When the government charged Bass with violating the statute, It didn't allege that he possessed guns in commerce or affecting commerce, because the government read the statute as prohibiting any possession of firearms by a convicted felon. Now, Bass challenged the government's reading of the statute, arguing that the government had to prove that he possessed guns in commerce or affecting commerce in order to prove a violation of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. And the Supreme Court agreed to decide that question after the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit ruled against Bass on its appeal from the trial court conviction. So, what did the Supreme Court majority hold in United States versus Bass? Although the majority would ultimately rely on the rule of lenity to decide the case, remember, I said that courts generally only use the rule of lenity as a tiebreaker when a statute is ambiguous. So the majority in United States versus Bass began its opinion with a discussion of the text of the statute. Again, they didn't jump right to the rule of lenity. So the key question for the court to decide was whether the language in commerce or affecting commerce, the language here, whether that only modified transport, up here, transports in commerce or affecting commerce, or whether down here, okay, it modified all three terms, receives, possesses, or transports in commerce or affecting commerce. On that question, the majority reasoned that the natural construction of the language suggests that in commerce or affecting commerce modified all three antecedents. So they take this second reading here, right? They say that it modified all three, receives, possesses, or transports, as opposed to just transports, okay? So they said that the natural reading of the statute was that it modified all three, but the argument for that reading, the majority said, was neither overwhelming nor decisive. Now, although the majority doesn't discuss it, there is a canon of statutory interpretation, the rule of the last antecedent, which would suggest that the phrase in commerce or affecting commerce should be read to modify only the last antecedent. That'd be this first reading here, transports, right? Unless context or punctuation suggest otherwise. That canon would support the government's reading of the statute, where they argued that you can be violating the statute as long as you possess it without having to show that it was possessed in commerce or affecting commerce. Now, in addition to suggesting most natural reading of the language was in commerce or effective commerce, modifying all three antecedents, the majority said it wouldn't make sense to prohibit the possession of firearms by convicted felons without a connection to commerce, but only transportation of firearms in commerce or affecting commerce, because most transportation of firearms would require possession. And there didn't appear any reason, consistent with the purpose of the statute, to apply the in commerce or affecting commerce language only to transporting. So again, looking at the text, the majority said, this doesn't seem to make sense. This seems to be more consistent with the purposes as well. So that was part of the majority's analysis. Now, they also looked at similar statutes to help interpret the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. So first, the court on the similar statutes and the context noted that in commerce or affecting commerce, reading that to modify all three terms would be consistent with the approach taken in other federal criminal statutes, which generally limit jurisdiction to activities in commerce or affecting commerce. So they said that if we look at other criminal federal criminal statutes, that language is generally applied to all the activities and not just transportation. And so their reading, the majority's reading of having the language apply to all three antecedents is consistent with other federal criminal statutes, etc. Then the majority spends a bit of time discussing the context of the statute itself. They looked at Title IV and Title VII of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. And the government argued that reading Title VII of the statute to only require a commerce nexus for transportation of a firearm is the better reading of Title VII, because if it required a commerce nexus for receipt, possession, or transportation, it would be redundant, because Title IV of the statute already makes it a crime for a person convicted of certain felonies to receive or transport a firearm. Well, the majority rejected that argument. The majority rejected the government's argument, saying that Title VII wouldn't be redundant if it were interpreted to require a commerce nexus for receipt, possession, or transportation of a firearm, because Title IV would still prohibit some activities that were not prohibited by the reading of Title VII, and Title VII would prohibit some activities that were not prohibited by the Title IV. So the majority decided either interpretation of the statute is going to create some redundancy, but the court wasn't going to determine how to eliminate the redundancy based on a search for legislative intent, because the statute was drafted hastily without a lot of thought about how Title IV and Title VII would work together. So they looked at the context there and the text. Then the majority looks at legislative history. So looking at legislative history to decide whether in commerce or affecting commerce modified just transportation, or whether it modified all three terms, again, right? Receives, possesses, or transports. Now, within the legislative history, the majority did find support and statements from the sponsor of the legislation for a reading of the statute to prohibit all possession of firearms by convicted felons without any need to prove a commerce connection. So there was support for that reading, okay, where they didn't need to show a connection to commerce for possession. At the same time, though, the majority also found support in a statement of a representative in the House for a reading of the statute that prohibits possession only if they are possessed across state lines. So again, tying the in commerce or affecting commerce language to all three terms. Ultimately, the majority concluded that the remarks of the legislature and legislative history are sufficiently ambiguous to invite mutually destructive dialectic and not much more. So again, they find not a whole lot of resolution from the legislative history. So after looking at the text, context, legislative history, and similar statutes, the majority wrote, after seizing everything from which aid can be derived, we are left with an ambiguous statute. So at that point, then, it was time for the rule of lenity. Okay, as I mentioned before, it's a tiebreaker that's applied when, after consulting all other sources of statutory interpretation, the court concludes the statute is ambiguous. So that's what happened here. Okay, this is, again, the traditional way that courts should apply the rule of lenity. Some of them don't. Some of them will just trot it out right at the beginning and not go through the whole analysis. But the way it's supposed to work is this way. They look at all the other sources of interpretation, and if they find that it's ambiguous, then they apply the rule of lenity. So the majority here says, after finding it's ambiguous, ambiguity concerning the ambit of criminal statutes should be resolved in favor of lenity. So again, they're telling us that, you know, we've got this presumption that if it's ambiguous, and it's a criminal statute or penal statute, we're going to read it narrowly in favor of the defendant. So in light of that, the majority decided that because of the ambiguity, we're going to adopt the narrower reading of the statute, that the phrase in commerce or affecting commerce is part of all three offenses, that the government has to prove for transportation, possession, or receipt that the action occurred in commerce or affecting commerce. So the court concluded that the conviction in this case had to be set aside because the government didn't allege or prove that the possession was in commerce or affecting commerce. They didn't show the nexus with interstate commerce. So that's a brief summary of United States versus Bass and the rule of lenity. So thank you for watching.